Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology Podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, episode 20. Hello? 20 whole episodes. Okay, not only that, but that also indicates that it's the end of season 2. How did that even happen? Honestly, I stopped keeping count. I cannot believe it's been that long. Well, it hasn't been that long, but 20 episodes, 2 whole seasons later, I'm about to get emotional. I should have brought some champagne and carrot cake to celebrate or something, honestly. So at the beginning of the season, I mentioned that starting with season 2, every season will be based on a theme, and for season 2, I wanted to focus a little more on government-funded psychology experiments. And if you go back all the way to the beginning, we started off with our 3-part MK Ultra series, then we had an episode on the Milgram experiment, we paid homage to my hometown university, go Dogs, and even NASA made an appearance. To end this season, I wanted to take a look at a study that when I did my research on it, it hit a little close to home because it takes place in my motherland's neighboring country. So in a way, it did feel like home to me. As many of you know, especially if you follow me on my socials, I am 100% Salvadorian. Both my parents were born in El Salvador, and so was I. So I am always so proud to rep my little country. So when I stumbled upon this study based on the neighboring country of Guatemala, it broke my heart, honestly, because we're all paisanos, you know? So to end the season, we're looking into the Guatemala syphilis experiments, a study that lasted only 2 years in the mid-1900s, known for its unethical experimentation on vulnerable human populations in Guatemala. So if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy, and let's jump into it. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, check out my shirt. My brother's a student pilot, and he's always giving me free t-shirts that he gets from his little academy events and stuff. So just feeling really comfortable today. Okay, so before we dive into the actual study itself, let's take a closer look at its roots. First, let's go back in time to 1932. In 1932, in Tuskegee, Alabama, there was a group of doctors who worked for the United States Public Health Service as well as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention who were on a mission to find a cure. These doctors were there to study, research, and experiment the effects of different treatment options for syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated. In the study, investigators enrolled a total of 600 lower middle class black men. Of these 600, 399 had latent syphilis, and the 201 that didn't were the control group. One of the major details of this study that made it what it is that these men did not know they were testing positive for syphilis. They didn't know they had syphilis. Rather, doctors told these men that they were being treated for something that they called bad blood. Now we got bad blood. Any sweeties out there? Anyways, so in the beginning, the doctors were telling their test subjects that they had nothing to worry about because they and their bad blood were in good hands. In fact, as an incentive for their participation, the men were promised free medical care for their bad blood. Although they were provided free medical and mental care that they would not have been receiving otherwise, it was not enough considering they were being deceived the whole time about their diagnosis. Not only were they being deceived about their diagnosis, but they also weren't receiving adequate treatment. What? On top of a completely made-up diagnosis, the participants were given disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and diagnostic procedures for their made-up bad blood, and nothing concrete for their very real syphilis. The men were initially told that the experiment was only going to last 6 months. However, it ended up lasting a total of 40 years. Also, ignore the noise in the background. Just pretend it's not there. A few years into the study, funding for syphilis treatment was cut, but that didn't stop the doctors from continuing their experiment. They continued without informing the men that they would never be treated again, at least not under the program's care, that is. And it wasn't until 1972 when a leak to the press resulted in the final termination of the 40-year experiment. 40 years too late. 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 died from the complications related to their syphilis, 40 of the men's wives were infected with syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis as a result of their biological father carrying the disease. Now let's take a closer look at a second history lesson. In 1943 to 1944, the Terre Haute prison in Indiana attempted to test preventative strategies for gonorrhea on consenting prisoners. In this experiment, the prisoners were given disclosures detailing every bit of the experiment, along with $100, a certificate of merit, and a letter of commendation to the parole board if they consented to and participated in the study all the way through. With a total of 241 consenting prisoners, the medical scientists took samples of gonorrhea from recently arrested sex workers, and with that, the researchers gathered a number of different strains of gonorrhea and experimented with the process of inoculation. So if you're a curious cat like me and English isn't your first language and you don't know what inoculation means, don't worry, I gotcha. So, inoculation is the action of immunizing someone against a disease by introducing ineffective material, microorganisms, or vaccine into the body. In other words, fighting one virus with another virus. In other words, the medical scientists purposely infected the debriefed and consenting prisoners with gonorrhea. They did this by applying a sample of gonorrhea to the end of each of the prisoners' penises. You know the gonorrhea that they obtained from the recently imprisoned sex workers? So the main man here, the one who was in charge of this experiment, his name is Dr. John Cutler. And Dr. John Cutler soon realized that there were too many inconsistencies with their method of inoculation. So much so that just 5 months into the experiment, they decided to end it because there were too many failed attempts at inoculation. The experiment officially ended just 10 months after it started. Now, these two pieces of history are extremely important to today's episode because today's experiment is based off both of these pieces. As mentioned, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments lasted from 1932 to 1972. The Terre Haute experiment lasted between 1943 and 1944. When medical scientists noticed the demand for a cure for syphilis through the Tuskegee study and a failed attempt to find that cure through the Terre Haute study, they decided to start thinking a little bit outside the box. So, for 2 years between 1946 and 1948, there was a similar study being conducted by the U.S. government over in the country of Guatemala. The intent of the study was to test the value of a different medication in the prevention of certain STDs, which of course included syphilis. And at the center of it all was Dr. John Cutler. One thing about Dr. John Cutler is he is not a quitter. So when he saw the failed attempt at the Terre Haute prison, he didn't give up. Dr. John Cutler saw this as a challenge given that the U.S. government was more hesitant to find a cure than ever before. You see, amidst World War II, soldiers were contracting STDs left and right due to their activities with sex workers. So the U.S. government was rushing to find a cure. In the early 1940s, government scientists discovered that penicillin could eliminate symptoms of syphilis within days of such infection. With this knowledge, the U.S. military began using penicillin as a means of post-STD exposure treatment. However, it was unclear whether it could be used in a similar manner for other STDs. This would turn out to be a difficult theory to test because at the time there was also a shortage of penicillin. Geez, I wonder why. So, because of this shortage and the constant demand for it, scientists were interested in testing the prophylactic ability of other agents. They had their testing chemicals and possible treatments. They just needed the right test subjects. Before you knew it, American scientists were taking a one-way trip to the country of Guatemala, where they were able to conduct their unethical experiments on vulnerable human populations of the Guatemalan people. The total study population included more than 5,500 Guatemalan prisoners, sex workers, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and orphan children. Once you get children involved, that's it. That's just it. Okay, and in order to have their controlled population, the U.S. government used different inoculation methods to test gonorrhea, syphilis, and cancroid. Remember that word? Inoculation, as in the same method they tried and failed to successfully use in the Terre-Haute experiment? Well, the reason the Terre-Haute experiment failed in the first place is that they couldn't find a reliable method of inoculation, so in Guatemala, they got creative. One of the scientists' most favored methods was what they called normal exposure. Through normal exposure, the scientists used sex workers who had already tested positive with syphilis to transmit the disease to unsuspecting prisoners. Now, you may be asking yourselves a multiple number of questions that can be difficult to put into words like I did, so let me help you out. You see, there were multiple reasons why the US government chose the country of Guatemala for their experiment to begin with. One, the most obvious, is that it was racially motivated. The entire testing staff consisted of white physicians and researchers whom simply deemed the Guatemalan people as minorities. The second most logical reason, at least to them, is that Guatemalan prisoners had the privilege to pay for prostitutes. This allowed for the infections to seem natural due to consensual intercourse with an infected sex worker, except they didn't know that the sex worker was infected with such disease. To the prisoners, it was just a case of bad luck. Meanwhile, they had no idea the whole thing had been orchestrated by the very doctors who were treating them for said bad luck. That takes care of the prisoners, but what about the others? The sex workers themselves were exposed to syphilis through inoculation of the cervix with a needle, similar to how the Terre-Haute prisoners were exposed to it through the tip of the penis. Either that or direct sexual contact with a prisoner who had already contracted syphilis from another sex worker. So it was kind of just like a round and round kind of thing. As for the psychiatric patients and the orphan children, it was ingestion through the mouth, the urethra, the rectum, or the eyes. Hopefully, as you begin to connect the dots, you start to understand that everything is being calculated by the American scientists. These American scientists were purposely infecting prisoners, sex workers, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and orphan children with syphilis, gonorrhea, and cancroid. And the cherry on top is that these victims had no fucking idea. It was all done without their consent. Now, any good scientists know that a good experiment needs a control group. Otherwise, they would just be testing on subjects that they had intentionally affected, and from a scientific point of view, you can't do that because it creates a giant bias. So in order to eliminate such a bias, they tested others within the populations and included them in their study if they tested positive. And of course, they kept tabs on who were the ones who'd been intentionally infected, so not to mix up the two test groups. You may be wondering, on top of everything else, how on earth the Guatemalan government could allow such a terrible thing to be done to their people. Well, the answer, my curious cats, is that they didn't. They were led to believe that the US government was there to conduct experimental treatments against STDs, which was true, except they had no idea that they were the ones giving the Guatemalan people the diseases in the first place. Oh, this makes me so angry just to think about, because the US government had everyone so fooled into thinking they were doing these studies for the greater good of the Guatemalan people, when in fact they couldn't give a shit about the Guatemalan people. The US is notoriously selfish and deceiving, and at the time, my poor Chapinas had no idea. So, as a measure that they called goodwill towards the Guatemalan government, but also to promote their study and not make their malicious intent so obvious, they initiated an STD treatment program for those whom tested positive for the STDs. About 820 subjects received some form of treatment for their infections, and almost 700 of the people receiving treatment were people who they had deliberately been infected by the American scientists. Let's rewind a little bit back, okay? Do you remember how many people I mentioned were part of the study? Over 5,500 victims, and only 820 subjects received some form of treatment. Now, sadly, that's pretty much the end of the study. There's no solid, let alone happy ending that explains to us how the experiments were stopped and every victim was compensated for. No, not at all. By 1948, 2 years after the experiment started, the American scientists began giving treatment to some but not all of their patients, as previously mentioned. The scientists would take blood samples that they'd retrieved from the infected patients and had many of them sent off to laboratories all around the states for further testing. Given how unethical the whole thing was, you'd think it would have more media attention. However, it wasn't until Cutler died in 2003 that a number of his research documents were found and investigated by the US government. It wasn't after years of investigation and obtaining solid proof of the experiments that the then President Barack Obama contacted the then President of Guatemala, Alvaro Colom, to apologize for the unethical nature of the research. One thing that's important to note about the investigation of these files is that Cutler explicitly stated in his unpublished research that his biggest concern was his reputation. His reputation, if word ever got out about the cruelty of the test and the fact that he knew medications such as penicillin, which was readily available, were effective in treating certain STDs, but he refused to use them in treatment. Furthermore, he explained how a lot of his fellow scientists and colleagues disagreed with him and his methods of research, but he essentially didn't give a shit. And now he's dead and burning in hell. To this day, it's speculated that some samples taken from the Guatemalan syphilis study are still being used to test on due to lack of regulations involving laboratory samples. One of the many scary things about individuals who are left untreated for their syphilis is that their pain isn't just in their physical health. The human brain is closely tied to the nervous and immune system, so when one is struggling, everything else is too. In the early stages of the STD, the person often sees a change in their mood swings and sleeping habits. Sleeping habits are mainly monitored by our hippocampus, which also plays a role in our emotions, such as our mood swings and our memory. Speaking of memory, the later stages of the STD often include memory loss and delusions that can lead to psychosis, symptoms which are directly correlated with our amygdala and our limbic system, all of which play a role in the health of our immune system in a number of different ways. All three of the studies mentioned today are connected. However, the Guatemala syphilis study may be the most detrimental of them all, even though it only lasted for 2 years. Populations of Guatemalan people were infected with an STD without their consent, all in the name of science, which is pure bullshit, given that medications such as penicillin had already been discovered at that point. If anything, the whole experiment is rooted in racism towards these populations, and we and they know that. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for joining me for another episode, and thank you so much for riding along with me all the way to the end of season 2. We'll be starting season 3 soon, and I can't wait to share with you guys what I have in store because season 3 is going to be a doozy. I can tell you that right now. So, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Follow the podcast on Instagram at the Say Psychology Podcast for episode news and updates. As always, citations for this week's episode will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.